Good afternoon. I'm Pat Callahan.
And I'm Cindy Williams. We have some breaking news to tell you about this at this hour. The jury in the trial of Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev has reached a decision on a sentence. That decision will be announced in about 15 minutes. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev will either spend life in prison or he will be sentenced to death.
The 21-year-old was found guilty on April 8th of 30 federal charges, including charges for the deaths of 4 people and conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction in the Boston Marathon bombings. 17 of the 30 charges he was convicted on carry the death penalty as the maximum sentence.
The same jury that found Tsarnaev guilty of all 30 federal counts will soon announce the penalty that he will face. The jury, made up of 7 women and 5 men, would have to have decided unanimously to sentence him to death. Even if one juror decides to sentence Tsarnaev to life in prison, he will not be sentenced to death.
We will be back as the verdict is being announced. We expect that around 3 o'clock. Until then, be sure to check our websites for more information, WCSH6.com and WLBZ2.com.
Hello, everyone. There is a verdict now, a sentence in the marathon bombing trial of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. I'm Cindy Williams.
And I'm Pat Callahan. We are being told now by the people in Boston that Dzhokhar Tsarnaev will be sentenced to death for his role in the Boston Marathon bombings, which resulted in the deaths of 3 people and the injuries to hundreds of people. A surprisingly fast verdict in this case, because they only got this case for the sentencing portion Wednesday afternoon. They worked about an hour Wednesday. They worked all day yesterday, and let's say 6 hours today.
Tsarnaev faced a total of 30 counts. 17 of those counts carried the possibility of the death penalty. It only took one of those counts to sentence him to death, but the jury had to be unanimous in its decision that he deserved to die for these crimes.
Let's remind you about the timeline of the events that led up to today's sentencing. The bombings happened at the finish line of the Boston Marathon on April 15, 2013, killing 3 people, injuring more than 260 others. 3 days later, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and his brother Tamerlan shot and killed MIT officer Sean Collier.
The next day, there was a shootout with police. Tamerlan died and Dzhokhar was taken into custody. Prosecutors then charged Dzhokhar Tsarnaev with 30 federal charges. Following a number of appeals to delay and to move the trial, jury selections finally started on January 5th of this year. Opening statements of the trial then began in early March.
The jury then convicted him of all 30 federal charges on April 8th after just about 11 hours of deliberations. The penalty phase of the trial began on April 21st, which was the day after this year's Boston Marathon. Now that phase is over. As we mentioned, we are getting word from Boston that he has been sentenced to death. We're joined in the studio now by a former U.S. attorney from Maine and a former federal prosecutor, now an attorney here in Maine, Jay McCloskey. First, Jay, your impression, I take it you're surprised by this verdict.
Well, I am surprised at how quickly it was arrived at, and quite frankly, I'm surprised at the result. I thought that if it came back this quickly, it probably would have been a non-death sentence, but obviously the jury is difficult to read until they actually come back with their verdict.
One of the things they did this afternoon is go through what they call a list of aggravating and mitigating circumstances. What is that? How does that play into this?
That's required really under the federal rules of procedure for determining whether a death sentence is appropriate. So you go through mitigating factors, factors which would warrant a non-death penalty sentence. You then go through factors that might warrant a death sentence, an aggravating factor, and they obviously came back in favor of the aggravating factors, which obviously might have outnumbered the mitigating factors, but to the extent that all were unanimous on a death penalty, I'm surprised.
Are you surprised just in general that it would be a death sentence given the fact that he's 21 years old, or that wouldn't be a factor?
Well, as a lawyer for almost 35 years, I'm always surprised at jury verdicts. Generally, you can't predict what a jury will do. Everybody thinks differently, but I must say that I was surprised at this result, particularly in Boston, where it's a non-death penalty state. There was testimony, I think, from one of the victims' families recommending a non-death sentence. So if I would have been a betting person, I would have bet that the non-death penalty would have been found by the jury, but it wasn't.
One line of reasoning that the defense tried to pursue through this is that the younger brother, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, was deeply under the influence of his older brother, Tamerlan, who was killed in the shootout the week of the marathon bombing. And yet, during the reading of the aggravating or mitigating circumstances, only 3 jurors agreed that he acted under the influence of his brother, and only 3 believed that Tamerlan Tsarnaev planned the bombing. Presumably, their thinking is, no, he was fully involved in this.
Well, obviously, that's the conclusion you would draw. And obviously the jury heard the evidence directly from the witnesses themselves, and they were in the best position to judge that. I mean, everybody on the outside watches it on the nightly news, but we don't hear the evidence day in and day out like the jurors do. So they're in the best position to judge that, and that's obviously how they felt.
And two of the other things that they decided was that Dzhokhar targeted the marathon bombing to do the most damage, and also that he showed no remorse. Is that a huge factor?
Well, I think that's probably a factor in the part of the jury, no question about it. But a person in that position obviously sometimes may feel remorse but doesn't show it, has to go into a sort of a deep within themselves and sort of not pay attention to things. So how he actually felt is hard to know, but the jury obviously concluded he felt no remorse.
We're talking with former U.S. Attorney for Maine, Jay McCloskey. Jay, now that the death sentence has been rendered, what's going to happen next? This is a long process.
It is a long process. First of all, there'll be direct appeals on the criminal case. For example, the defense lawyers will appeal the fact that the case was not transferred out of Boston. That will go to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. After all those regular appeals are taken, there'll be post-conviction motions, and that's what takes a long time, and that's why there have been so many people on death row for so many years with no decision.
And in fact, we haven't had a federal execution in about 13 years, right?
At least that. I think it goes back to early 2001, 2002.
Yeah. There are 60 federal prisoners on death row. And I think an interesting thing that a lot of people cite in trying to make these decisions, a lot of people think it's much more expensive to pay to keep someone alive in prison than it is to execute them. That's not necessarily the case.
Well, you'd have to look at an individual circumstance, but I know obviously it's very expensive both to house somebody for the rest of their life, and obviously it's very expensive to actually carry out the death penalty because of the number of appeals, lawyers' fees, and so forth. So I think actually the amount of money that it might take to actually execute somebody may be more in most circumstances than it does to keep them in jail for the rest of their lives. Obviously, it depends on the age of the defendant. In this case,
how long they live.
Yeah, he's obviously very young.
Right.
Given the long list of capital offenses that he was convicted of, 17 of them, I think, does it, again, we get back to the idea of how little time it seems was spent deliberating. It seems highly unusual.
It is very shocking to me. I've watched trials for over 30 years, and sometimes a regular average trial will take more time than this took. So there obviously was a very persuasive case made to the jury. And obviously they considered it very carefully, and they were unanimous in their verdict. So the jury obviously speaks last.
When you talk about those appeals that are essentially automatic, one about whether the trial should have been moved, do you think there's any grounds for that being successful?
Well, not many have been successful so far. You know, every once in a while somebody makes an argument that's successful, but I doubt in this case that it'll ultimately prevail, but one never knows.
And Judy Clark was Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's attorney. She has been very successful in avoiding the death penalty.
Yeah, she's a very experienced attorney, so she certainly knows what arguments to make in order to avoid the death penalty.
You can certainly argue that this is a highly emotional case, if whether you live in Boston or not, because it's a case of domestic terrorism, this thing hitting home. It's the greatest fear many people have.
Children being killed.
That young children were involved, including one who was killed, others maimed. It's probably impossible to take that emotion out of the jury room, isn't it?
No, I think it is difficult to take it out of the jury room, and I'm not sure it should be taken out of the jury room. Obviously, they have to consider what happened, the impact of that event on the lives of all those people who were hurt or killed, and ultimately they probably consider what the deterrent value is on the next effort to commit a terrorist act.
All right, Jay, if you would just stand by for a moment. We want to go now to Boston, where News Center's Chris Rose is standing by. Chris?
Well, good afternoon, Pat. That's right. The sentence is death for Dzhokhar Tsarnaev on 6 of the capital counts. That is the decision of the jury. And the form that jurors had to fill out is 24 pages long. And some of the questions they had to answer very telling. Of course, the defense was trying to portray the fact that Dzhokhar was influenced by his older brother, Tamerlan. And when asked questions regarding that, only 3 out of the 12 jurors felt that Dzhokhar's brother, Tamerlan, planned, led, and directed the marathon bombing. A number of jurors jurors who find that just 3 out of the 12. Also just 3 feeling that he had influence over his younger brother. A couple of the other questions, is Dzhokhar Tsarnaev highly unlikely to commit, incite, or facilitate any acts of violence in the future while serving a life sentence in federal custody? Only 1 out of the 12 jurors felt that that is likely. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, has he expressed any sorrow and remorse for what he did and the suffering he caused? Number of jurors, only 2 out of the 12 felt that. So this process lasted about 20-25 minutes. They went through this entire 24-page docket with all of the questions that jurors had to answer, and in the end they found that 6 of the capital offenses are enough for the sentence of death for Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. So that is the jury's verdict. That came down just a short time ago, a death penalty sentence for Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. Right now, things in front of the court, a lot of media here, no one has come out yet. Things are still going on inside the courthouse with the judge talking to the attorneys. He did talk to the jurors and thank them for their service, and that's where we stand right now. We'll have much more in this story coming up live at 5, 5:30, and 6. Pat, back to you.
All right, Chris, we'll see you at 5 o'clock. Thank you.
Throughout Tsarnaev's trial, we have attempted to keep everyone updated with what has happened inside the federal courthouse in Boston nearly every day. Now it's time to focus on the victims of the Boston Marathon bombings.
We will, of course, have much more about today's decision coming up on News Center at 5 and online at WCSH6.com and WLBZ2.com. But for now, we leave you with a video to remember those who lost their lives at the finish line of Marathon Monday in 2013 and the man who was killed just days after the bombings during the manhunt for the Tsarnaev brothers. Convicted Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev is sentenced to death for his role in the marathon bombings. Good evening, I'm Pat Callahan.
And I'm Cindy Williams. Tsarnaev, who is 21 years old, was found guilty on April 8th on all 30 federal charges he faced, including charges in the deaths of 4 people and conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction. 17 of the 30 charges he was convicted of carry the possibility of the death penalty as a maximum sentence. He was sentenced to death on 6 of those 17 counts. The jury, made up of 7 women and 5 men, decided unanimously to sentence him to death. If one juror had decided to sentence Tsarnaev to life in prison, it would have been a very different outcome.
They spent only about 15 hours deliberating, and their decision was announced at about 3:30 this afternoon.
We head now to Boston. News Center's Chris Rose has been following this trial since the beginning. He joins us now with the latest from Boston. Chris.
Well, Cindy, you can see the large crowd gathered behind me. Some of the law enforcement officials, some of the people involved in the investigation are now addressing the media, including the head of the northern New England part of the FBI, Vincent Lizzie, Carmen Ortiz, the U.S. attorneys whose office prosecuted this case. They're addressing the media right now. Now, the jurors did find that death was appropriate for 6 of those capital accounts. All they needed to find was that it was appropriate for just 1 of them, but they did find 6, and they sentenced Tsarnaev to death. The prosecutor called Tsarnaev a remorseless terrorist, while the defense tried to show that he was led astray by his older brother. Now, jurors had this 24-page form that they had to go through, and we found out some of what the jurors were thinking by what they filled out on this form. One of the questions, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was particularly susceptible to his older brother's influence. Number of jurors who found so, only 3 out of the 12. So the majority shot down that defense theory. Number of jurors who thought that Tsarnaev's brother Tamerlan planned, led, and directed the bombing. Jurors 3 out of the 12. So jurors just not buying the fact that Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was simply going along with what his brother wanted. A couple of other things on here, that Tsarnaev is unlikely to commit any acts of violence while serving a life sentence in prison. Only 1 juror found that. And also the number of jurors who feel that Tsarnaev has expressed sorrow and remorse for what he did and the pain and suffering he caused. Only 2 2 out of the 12 found that. So the counts that they did find him that deserve the death penalty include use of a weapon of mass destruction and bombing of a public place. Now, afterwards, the judge called the jury a model jury that should be a model for future juries. He thanked them for all their service and said that, you know, justice was served in this case. The U.S. Attorney from Massachusetts, Carmen Ortiz, said that even the worst of the worst deserve a fair trial, and she says that Tsarnaev got it, and now he will pay with his life for his crimes. So we will have much more coming up. Some of the victims and some of the relatives of victims expected to come out and address the media after the law enforcement officials finish up there at the podium behind me. That's the latest here in Boston. I'm Chris Rose, back to you in the studio.
All right, Chris, thank you. Tsarnaev becomes the youngest person on federal death row. He will join 60 other federal inmates there. Compare that to the 3,000 inmates on death row at the state level. Timothy McVeigh was one of the last federal prisoners to be executed. That happened in 2001. It was 4 years after he was found guilty of bombing a federal building in Oklahoma City and killing 168 people. To put that in perspective, the Oklahoma City bombing was in 1995, which means it took 2 years to convict him, another 4 years to execute him. If the appeals in this case are not successful and Tsarnaev is the next to be put to death, he would be the 4th federal prisoner since 1963 to be executed and the 1st since 2003. Tsarnaev would be executed at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. That was chosen as the designated place for federal executions because of its central location in the country. Tsarnaev would be allowed a last meal of his choosing before he would be executed. He would be killed by lethal injection. We are now going to turn to a panel of 2 lawyers who are standing by with Pat Callahan for some reaction to today's verdict. Pat?
Cindy, thanks. We're joined now by Jay McCloskey and Stacey Newman. They're both attorneys here in Portland. Jay is a former U.S. attorney for Maine and with the firm of McCloskey, Mina and Cuniff. Newman, a former federal prosecutor as well, and an attorney with the firm Murray, Plum and Murray, and has worked on several death penalty cases. I know you were both surprised by this verdict today. Jay, why?
Well, I think, first of all, the amount of time that it took to reach a verdict was somewhat surprising since death was to be considered. You would think that there might be more disagreement among the jurors as to whether death was a appropriate decision. But in fact, the jury obviously was quite united in their result because they came back so quickly.
Stacey, what do you think? Why are you surprised?
Well, first of all, the path of the nation is not to impose death, including on this specific case. And then when you bring it to Massachusetts, I think it was, you know, less than 20%. And that had even gone down since the trial began. But I think one of the things to consider with that is when you're polling the nation, you get people who don't believe in the death penalty. And of course, the only people who were eligible and did sit on Tsarnaev's case were people who agreed they could impose death.
In court today, the jurors had to answer questions about the various mitigating circumstances or aggravating circumstances. For example, a mitigating circumstance might have been, oh, he was led astray by his older brother. Only 3 of the jurors agreed with that. Does that surprise you?
It does, especially considering his defense team and what a job they did putting that on, and the evidence as I heard it was presented. It really does surprise me, and I think that's why the verdict came back so quickly for death. Is
there emotion involved in a jury case like this when it's domestic terrorism hitting so close to home, well, and such a large attack?
Well, I think that was really probably what carried the day. It was the terrorism aspect and the fact that it was conducted at a very public event, the Boston Marathon, and I think people could think, the jurors could think about sending a message to others who might commit similar crimes. And we've had some instances of that in this country, so, or attempts to do it. So I think maybe that was a message that the jury was trying to send in deciding to implement the death penalty.
You had others arguing against the death penalty, saying, for example, make him a martyr. Others saying, well, you even had families of victims asking that they want to put a closure to it now, knowing that the appeals can take so long. Does it surprise you that that apparently held no sway?
Well, I think the thing that surprised me was that one of the families came out and was against the death penalty. You'd think that would have carried a lot of weight with the jurors, but evidently it wasn't enough.
Stacey, that's pretty emotional stuff to ignore.
It is, yeah, and I do wonder how much of that the jury knew. Can't be directly discussed, but it did come out on the front page of the Boston paper, and again, it was the mother of the boy who died. So I agree, completely surprising knowing that information.
Right. We'll talk more about this at 6 o'clock. Stacey, Jay, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Cindy?
We want to look at how these events unfolded. The bombings happened at the finish line of the Boston Marathon on April 15th of 2013. 3 people were killed, 260 injured. 3 days later, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and his brother Tamerlan shot and killed MIT officer Sean Collier. The next day, there was a shootout with police. Tamerlan died and Dzhokhar was taken into custody. Prosecutors then charged Dzhokhar with 30 federal counts following appeals to delay and move the trial. Jury selection finally started on January 5th of this year. Opening statements of the trial began in early March. The jury then convicted him of all 30 charges on April 8th after about 11 hours of deliberations. The penalty phase of the trial started on April 21st, the day after this year's Boston Marathon. Tsarnaev's lead defense lawyer, Judy Clark, is considered to be one of the nation's most effective opponents of capital punishment. She has argued against the death penalty for many of the country's most notorious criminals, including Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, Atlanta Olympics bomber Eric Rudolph, 9/11 conspirator Zacarias Moussaoui, Jared Lee Loughner, the man who killed 6 people and injured Representative Gabby Giffords in the shooting outside a grocery store in Tucson, Arizona. We are going to have more on today's news in just a few minutes, but first it is time to focus on the victims of the Boston Marathon bombings, those who lost their lives at the finish line of the marathon on Monday 2013, and the man who was killed just days after the bombings during the manhunt for the Tsarnaev brothers.
It is death for Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. Jurors in Boston, some of them with tears in their eyes, sentenced the Boston Marathon bomber to die for his crimes.
Fire in Rumford. A motel in that town goes up in flames.
And a new safety system was installed on that Amtrak train that derailed in Philadelphia, but it wasn't turned on. The latest on the investigation and why you won't see that safety system on any Amtrak trains here in Maine. Good afternoon, I'm Rob Caldwell.
And I'm Cindy Williams. We will get to all of those stories in the coming half hour. And we begin in Boston, where the only man to stand trial for the Boston bombing, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, was sentenced to death.
News Center's Chris Rose is at the federal courthouse in Boston with more. Chris?
Well, Rob, still a very active scene here. You can see the crowd gathered behind me. Some of the survivors of the marathon bombing, some relatives of victims as well, are now down here addressing the media. We can tell you what a couple of them said. Liz Norden, whose 2 sons were injured, said, "There is no winner here today, but I do have justice for my family." Another said that she feels like she can breathe again. While this is not totally over, a big chapter has been turned. She says she's not happy, but she is pleased with the outcome. Now, jurors did find that death was the appropriate sentence for 6 of the capital counts that Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was convicted of. All they needed was a unanimous decision on just one of those to find for the death penalty, and that is the sentence that they decided on and agreed to today. That was after about 14.5 hours of deliberations over a course of 3 days. Now, throughout the trial, the prosecutor painted Tsarnaev as a remorseless terrorist, while the defense was trying to show that he was led astray by his older brother Tamerlan. But in this 24-page document that jurors had to fill out during their deliberations, they gave some insight onto just the fact that they did not buy that argument. One of the questions asked, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, was he particularly susceptible to his older brother's influence? 3 of the 12 jurors said yes, so a majority did not think he was influenced by his older brother. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's brother Tamerlan planned, led, and directed the marathon bombing. Just 3 jurors found that they thought that was true. So that was 3 out of the 12. So what we have now is the counts that they did find him that would include the death penalty included counts that were use of a weapon of mass destruction and bombing a public place. Carmen Ortiz, the U.S. Attorney from Massachusetts, said even the worst of worst deserve a fair trial, and she said Tsarnaev got this. She said that Tsarnaev will now pay with his life for his crimes. Here's what she had to say after the decision was made.
A child was murdered with a weapon of mass destruction. Another two young women as well. A police officer was executed in the line of duty. And so when you look at the gravity of the harm, and in particular as well, the many victims who became amputees and many others who are suffering with other forms of injuries. And then you look at the motives, as we said in our case, the political motives. Really, this was an act of terrorism. Then that process began, and the Department of Justice approved a path that provided for the severest of punishment.
Now, this was, you can imagine, a very emotional trial for everyone involved, the prosecutors, people who were in the audience, the victims, the relatives. It just was an emotional time seeing some of these images, some of the injuries, just horrific scenes. And the U.S. Attorney and a prosecutor spoke a little bit about that today as well. And at the end of it all, the judge said he thanked the jury for their service and said they were a model and that they should serve as a model for future juries. So once again, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the jury has decided that death will be the penalty for the Boston Marathon bombings. Live in Boston, I'm Chris Rose. Back to you, Rob, Cindy.
Thank you, Chris. The bomb Tsarnaev and his brother made and set off killed 3 people.
They were 8-year-old Martin Richard, 23-year-old Ling-Zi Lu, and 29-year-old Crystal Campbell. Tsarnaev was also found guilty in the shooting death of MIT police officer Sean Collier, who was killed during the manhunt for the suspects in the days after the bombing.
Now that Tsarnaev has been sentenced to death, he will almost certainly be taken to a federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. That is where he will be executed by lethal injection. Up to 8 victims or members of the victims' families will be allowed to watch the execution. Tsarnaev will be allowed to choose 1 spiritual advisor, 2 lawyers, and 3 family members to witness his death. He will be permitted to make a brief final statement, and he will be able to designate 1 person to handle the disposal of his body.
But I remember when those bombs went off, and I remember the vile, disgusting thing that this person did, and his brother. And they destroyed countless innocent lives, destroyed bodies and parts. Very vivid memories for many people and many families. This is nothing to celebrate. This is a matter of justice.
Reaction to the decision by a jury sentencing Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev to death. Good evening. I'm Pat Callahan.
And I'm Cindy Williams. It took jurors less than 3 days to decide to sentence Dzhokhar Tsarnaev to death.
The same jury that convicted him unanimously believes Tsarnaev should die, sentenced to death on 6 of the 17 federal charges he was convicted on that carry the death penalty. The makeshift explosives that Tsarnaev and his older brother Tamerlan set off at the Boston Marathon finish line in 2013 killed 3 people: 8-year-old Martin Richard, 23-year-old Ling-Zi Lu, and 29-year-old Crystal Campbell. Tsarnaev was also found guilty in the shooting death of MIT police officer Sean Collier during the manhunt for the brothers. News Center's Chris Rose has been covering the trial for us, and he joins us now from Boston with reaction to today's sentence. Chris?
Well, good evening. Here at the federal courthouse in Boston, jurors found that it was appropriate for 6 of the capital counts that Tsarnaev was convicted of for the penalty to be death. They only needed to find that 1 was appropriate for death, a unanimous decision, but they did find for 6. It took them about 14.5 hours over a course of 3 days to come up with that decision. Now, throughout this process, the prosecutor portrayed Tsarnaev as a remorseless terrorist, while the defense tried to show that he was led astray by his older brother Tamerlan. During the deliberations, jurors had to fill out a 24-page packet before releasing this decision, and in it you can see that they did believe that Tsarnaev did not have any remorse and that he was not led astray by his brother. For example, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was particularly susceptible to his older brother's influence. Only 3 out of the 12 jurors found that to be true. That Tsarnaev's brother Tamerlan planned, led, and directed the marathon bombing. Only 3 out of the 12 found that to be true. Also, when asked that Tsarnaev expressed any sorrow and remorse for the pain and suffering he caused, only 2 of the 12 jurors found that to be true. So you can see conflicting reports on both sides, that they believed what the prosecutor was saying, but they did not buy the defense's story that Tsarnaev was influenced by his older brother. Now, afterwards, survivors of the bombing and relatives of the victims spoke about Tsarnaev's fate.
I'm sure at one time in his life he was a very lovely, caring young man. What he turned into, obviously, was, we know what he turned into. He turned into a monster.
Ultimately, justice has prevailed today. His premeditated actions to stand behind children, wait 4.5 minutes with a fully loaded bomb, and then to call his brother and tell him when to explode his bomb moments earlier. His justice now. He wanted to go to hell, and he's going to get there early.
Very emotional throughout this process for everyone involved, from the attorneys to the jurors to people in the audience, just viewing some of the horrific images and hearing some of the heart-wrenching stories from the victims who testified throughout this. Now, afterwards, Carmen Ortiz, the U.S. Attorney from Massachusetts, said that even the worst of the worst deserve a fair trial, and that's what Tsarnaev got. And now she says he will pay with his life for his crimes. Live in Boston, I'm Chris Rose. Back to you.
All right, thank you, Chris. We're joined now by Jay McCloskey and Stacey Newman. Both are attorneys here in Portland. Jay is a former U.S. attorney for Maine with the firm McCloskey, Mina and Cuniff. Stacey is also a former federal prosecutor and attorney with the firm Murray, Plum and Murray. Stacey, what do you think sealed the deal for these jurors?
Well, it's hard to know. It sounds like they were convinced almost immediately that the heinousness, of this tragedy. 4 people killed, including the young boy. 17 people, I think, lost limbs. And clearly, from the verdict, they weren't buying the mitigating factors.
Jay, what's your sense about that?
Well, I think obviously they were unanimous almost going in, or you wouldn't get this kind of result so quickly in a death penalty case. So they were persuaded, obviously, by the emotion of the evidence at trial, and the fact that the defendant had no remorse, I think, was probably carried a lot of weight. And ultimately, I think that perhaps what they were trying to do is send a message to others who might commit similar crimes that if they do that, they're going to receive the death penalty.
One of the interesting things here is that Massachusetts, like Maine, is not a death penalty state. And yet they were able to find a jury that was chosen and agreed to by both sides that clearly was willing, and in this case quite able, to issue a death penalty.
Well, obviously they have to agree that they would vote for the death penalty if appropriate, so they didn't get people who are absolutely opposed to the death penalty. So you knew from the beginning that these people would vote for the death penalty under certain circumstances, or at least that's what they told the judge who picked the jury, the judge and the lawyers. So it's not surprising, I guess, that they ultimately voted that way based upon the evidence they heard.
We've had other domestic terrorists who have been sentenced to life in prison instead. Is perhaps the difference in the scale of this attack?
I think so. The notoriety, certainly. I mean, Timothy McVeigh, 168 people died. This was 4, but so many people injured, so many real tragic losses of limbs. And at the Boston Marathon, with so many people watching and viewing in a place that is supposed to be a community.
Well, how long is it liable to take for him to actually be executed?
Years. I mean, I think years. There's an automatic appeal, and there's not much of a history with federal death penalty cases, but since the last imposition of death in a federal case, so much has changed with the death penalty. There's challenges now to the drugs used for lethal injection, so I think it'll take years.
This could take many years.
Yeah, in fact, some of the people presently on death row, federal death row, have been there up to 20 years, so you can expect this to take quite some time.
All right, we'll see how it plays out. Jay, Stacey, thanks so much for being with us. Cindy?
Dzhokhar Tsarnaev will be the youngest prisoner in federal death row. He joins 60 others there. He'll be executed at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. Timothy McVeigh was one of the last federal prisoners to be executed. That happened in 2001, 4 years after he was found guilty of bombing the federal building in Oklahoma City and killing 168 people. Tsarnaev would be the fourth person since 1963 to be executed, the first since 2003. The Death Penalty Information Center says the average cost of defending a trial in a federal death case is about $621,000, 8 times that of a federal murder case in which the death penalty is not sought.